Hello, AP World Historians. I'm back. I know I haven't done these videos in a little bit. I'll probably go back and do the other ones that we kind of skipped over, but just wanted to go ahead and do one for this particular unit, Unit 5.1. We'll probably do one for 5.2 also, which we'll be taking a look at very, very soon. Yeah, Unit 5, it's kind of a wild one. We got a little bit of what do you call it? We got a little bit of the Enlightenment coming on here. We got some like intellectual kind of thoughts, but we also have some different revolutions that are going to be coming through as well. So I wanted to go ahead and drop in, do a little video here for you to talk about Unit 5.1 initially, and then we'll probably do another one that's going to be for 5.2 a little bit after that. Okay. Hope you're all doing well. You're fantastic. Let's check it out. Let's go to our next slide then. So this is going to be 5.1. Unit 5 is a brand new unit. It's the Enlightenment, is the initial 5.1 part of the unit. Unit 5 in general is really about revolutions and big changes. So we're looking at things like this concept of the Enlightenment. We're looking at things like these different revolutions that are going to take place. We're also going to be looking at the Industrial Revolution, which is also something that's going to come up very, very soon as well. Weirdly, the course and exam description does like 5.1 Enlightenment, 5.2 Revolutions, and then it's like 5.3 to 5.10 is about the Industrial Revolution, which, hey, look, I'm the first to admit the Industrial Revolution is important, but I feel like we should spend a little more time maybe on some of these revolutions. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. In the meantime, though, we're looking at the Enlightenment, which is the initial thing that's going to spur a lot of this stuff going on. So what is the Enlightenment? Well, it obviously comes from the word to enlighten, or enlightenment in general, which is going to be to, like all of a sudden have a brilliant idea or brilliant concept to enlighten your ideals and your thoughts. It's going to stem originally back from all the way back to the scientific revolution, which we talked about a little bit before. The scientific revolution, again, is going to be the explosion all of a sudden in new types of scientific method style scientific inquiry that we're going to see. So it'll start off with those astronomers like Galileo and others. It will also be heavily influenced by guys like empiricism, Francis Bacon, who we'll see pop up here as well. And we'll continue on then through all kinds of other things like through medicine, through physics, through chemistry, etc. Over time. And so what happens then is that once a lot of people take a look at those concepts, they start thinking, where else maybe could we apply some of these concepts that are out there? And so that is where we are going to get into the Enlightenment. All right, so what is it in a general sense? It is the shift from superstition and community and a move towards reason and individualism. So if you're hanging around in 13th, 14th century Europe, and again, the Enlightenment is a European thing. If you're hanging around in the 13th or 14th century Europe and you are pondering your day-to-day, right, superstition is a big factor there, right? You're going to say your prayers to make sure that you aren't hunted by witches or whatever, that kind of stuff, right? So that is a big part of it. Also, people are in smaller communities and they are really concerned with the factors of those communities themselves. So, you're really concerned about making sure that you are making good marriage matches, that you're fulfilling your obligations to the community to the extent that it basically almost erases some of that individual kind of person that you have. So Enlightenment then is going to move, instead of superstition, you're going to move towards reason. And instead of community, we're going to move more towards individualism, that the individual is also capable of great things. It's not necessarily a negation of community. Like, community is still super important, but it is going to elevate the ideas of the individual into the same realm, in a sense, of the community as well. So what is the difference between this idea of superstition and reason? So superstition, again, is going to be based upon sort of like faulty belief systems, stuff like that. Reason, on the other hand, then will rely upon good quality argumentation or concepts that will be shared as well. So you want to think about things and say, well, if this is true, then this must be true as well. All that kind of good stuff. So logic is something that's going to be a real big part of this as well. So the science of human society is what really this is about. So this is, again, building off of the scientific revolution. So these different people are like, well, look, if the scientific revolution allows us to discover things about the world that are based in science, perhaps using these same kind of concepts, we can apply reason and experimentation to human societies and perhaps perfect these human societies. These folks are, well, I would call them a little bit naive, but these folks are kind of like obsessed with the idea that like there is a perfect world that essentially God has given to us. But what we need to do is we need to figure out what that is, and therefore we can make it better. So if we only study it enough, right? If we study all the science, if we study physics, if we study chemistry, and if we study human society as well, we would hopefully be able to understand those things better. So for example, today we have like studies like psychology or political science. They owe a lot back to this idea of the Enlightenment. Progress is created by applying reason to natural laws. And part of this aspect then is that it will minimize religion in public life. Many of these folks are very still religious. So for example, we talk about our founders in the United States. They have lots of passages where they talk about God, but it's not to the same level that we would have otherwise. Those folks are heavily inspired by the Enlightenment, but they are not as religious as maybe somebody would have been even 100 years prior to that. This is known as the Age of Isms, meaning like, communism, socialism, capitalism, all that kind of stuff, because of all these different philosophies that are created. Enlightenment thinkers looked at all parts of the world and tried to design ideas and systems to fix these problems. So we have examples where they're like, well, criminality, people are committing crimes and that's bad. How can we make that better? What can we do to make that better? So they will try to fix that part to it. Government is corrupt and it has problems. What if we apply these ideas of reason and progress to there? Maybe we can fix those problems. We probably know how that went. So that kind of concept as well. So any of the kind of like human sort of societal things, poverty, illness, disease, all these kind of things are things that they want to try to do something about to try to make things better. This is kind of like a side off, but one of the things that we'll see in this time period too is going to be nationalism, which is one overarching idea that a lot of these folks kind of believe as well. That's intense loyalty to your people of your country. The little picture above me here is a little bit hard for me to read because I'm an old man. But there in the middle, it says the paradigm of the Enlightenment. And around the outside, then, you can see a bunch of the concepts there, right? Like progress, individualism, freedom, empiricism, science, etc. So those are all things that would be feeding into the concepts of Enlightenment. All right, next up. We're going to learn a little bit about some of these Enlightenment thinkers. Now, you will most likely do some sort of project in class where you are going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on some of these folks, but these folks that we're going to mention here today are going to be some of like the bedrock people. Like these are the big boys and girls. So we have early Enlightenment thinkers. We'll talk about others as we go through down to the late Enlightenment thinkers as well. So let's just talk about a few of these folks. You don't, again, have to have all this memorized, but it would be good to know the basics of who these folks are. Like, for example, if you know Thomas Hobbes is a Enlightenment figure about government, that would be really good. If you can remember he's a social contract or something, that's even better. But again, you don't have to have each and every one of these folks memorized. I'll start off with Francis Bacon. We talked about this guy before when we talked about the scientific revolution. This is that idea of empiricism, that we can test and we can experiment, and that will lead us to the truth. That is also what we're going to see that the Enlightenment thinkers will embrace as well. Knowledge is what comes from your observed experience. So if there's something weird going on and you can't explain it, you don't just make up stuff about witches or something. You instead say, well, I can't explain that my observed experience is not helping in this situation. So scientific experiments then would show us the way. So we can perform like societal experiments or otherwise, like, maybe not experiments in this case, but you could do like case studies of different governments. So you find all the governments in the world that have parliaments and you write about them with like a certain problem or something. Or alternately with psychology, there actually are some experiments in psychology that you can perform to do that, as long as they're ethical, which they aren't always. Next up then is going to be this guy Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes is going to be an example of an early Enlightenment thinker who is going to be talking about government. Government is one of the big things that they start with. They're going to eventually branch out to other stuff, but government is a huge factor. So Thomas Hobbes writes a book called Leviathan in 1651. Leviathan is the name that he sort of gives the powerful government. He will argue that humans essentially are bad people. And this is a big debate amongst Enlightenment figures, is are human beings good or are human beings bad? It's also a debate amongst religions. So in this case, Hobbes argues that humans are really, really bad. They will inevitably kill each other and all this stuff. So what we need is a strong government to rule us, to protect us from these things. So he would be a big fan of the absolute monarchs. He essentially also, though, so that's not as famous, like it doesn't carry over as much, but the idea that we have a social contract with the government where we give up rights in order to be protected by the government is a big one for Hobbes. That's a big one that carries over. And this is a pretty obvious situation here, right? Like if you have a car, right? In our society, you have to have a driver's license to be able to drive that car. That is a part of our social contract. We are giving up our right just to like hop in a car and drive all over the place without any sort of skills to the government, because we believe that other people having those skills or having that testing kind of thing is a good thing. So as long as the government is getting other people to test as well, that is a positive thing for us to do. So we should try to do that. But there's lots of other examples too. There's like great examples about like violence and stuff. Like you give up your right to violence, and in order to do that, then the government has that right instead, like through the police or through the military. And the idea is that they are going to protect you because you have given up some of that. Anyway, you get the point. On the other hand, then we have John Locke. He writes this book called Two Treatises on Government, 1690. He agrees about the concept of the social contract, but felt that the government owed us as well. So it's not just the powerful government, it's also the other side. He is the guy that comes up with this concept that if the government is sort of oppressive or bad, we do have a right to overthrow it. So if you have like a really super oppressive government, like communist Russia or something, then you are well within your Enlightenment rights to try to overthrow it. Up above me here, this picture is of a salon. What these Enlightenment thinkers like to do is they would gather into big rooms and they would discuss and talk about the issues and problems of the day. This is particularly popular in France. Salon, which has come to mean a haircutting place, but at the time meant like a kind of discussion kind of thing, are examples of that. So here we have a whole bunch of bewigged men and nicely dressed ladies, and they're all sitting around reading the latest treatise from John Locke or somebody and debating about how important it is. Okay. Next up. So the Philosophers then are going to kind of come a little bit later than the early Enlightenment thinkers. They are going to be French almost exclusively, and the word itself means sort of philosophers, but they are typically grouped together. They're a group of writers and thinkers, primarily French, that looked at new ways of thinking at the world. So they're going to expand beyond just the government stuff and do like government, economic, social kind of things as well. So one of these important guys here is Baron Montesquieu. He's going to write The Spirit of Laws in 1748, which is an essay on government. He admired and spoke well about the British system, which had these sort of checks and balances, and he's the guy that comes up with this idea of the three branches of government, that we should have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, and that they should have checks on each other. So the presidency can check the Parliament, and the Parliament can check the the Congress can check the president, etc. Is one of his major ideas. We also have this amazing guy named Voltaire. I'll show you some things from him in just a second. Voltaire's hilarious. He's basically like the earliest of the Twitter trolls. I mean, he basically sort of lived to just to be funny and mean to people all the time. So he wrote a very famous book called Candide in 1762. He was a social commentator who advocated civil liberties in France during the monarchy, and he had these very important ideas of religious freedom as well. So he was a big believer that like you should basically be able to do what you want to do as long as it's not harming people in a sense. So if your religion is different than the majority religion, it's fine. Like you should be able to do what you want. Like, have your religious freedom. It's not really harming anybody else necessarily. Same thing also with the ideas of civil liberties as well. Like you should be able to say what you want to say. I mean, as long as it is within reason. The old fire in a crowded theater stuff probably would not want to be happening, but otherwise you should be able to do kind of what you want to do. Next up, then, we got Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that he wrote The Social Contract in 1762, which will expand on the idea of the social contract, which we just talked about. And he will specifically talk about this idea of the general will, which is that the general will of the population should be carried out by the ruler. So if the people are wanting lower taxes or higher taxes or whatever, that kind of stuff, that the ruler should try to carry those things out, that they should try to do the general will of the population. Now, they would definitely believe in big mobs wanting stuff, and they shouldn't do that, but they should try to do what the population wants. And maybe sometimes that means they interpret what the people want, but still, the idea is the general will should be the best. Let me show you some fun Voltaire quotes here. Guy is just fantastic. That's a picture of him over there. Voltaire is a pen name. His actual name was Jean-Marie Arouet, I think. I could be wrong about that. But Voltaire, if you want to know who controls you, look at who you are not allowed to criticize. So you criticize, your government and they arrest you, or if you criticize, I don't know, your principals or teachers, then you know that you are. If you get in trouble, then you're not allowed to criticize them. So again, kind of an early pithy Twitter troll. This is one of my favorite ones, though. So he dies. He was an atheist during the course of his life. He definitely had some ideas on religious liberty. Like he thought people should be able to be religiously however they want. But he himself was not religious. And so this is a great quote. Now, my good man, this is no time for making enemies, which is Voltaire on his deathbed when asked by a priest to renounce Satan. Whoa. Twitter troll. I love it. Just a funny kind of strange person, but very interesting fellow. Lots of great Voltaire quotes on the internet if you want to look a few up. All right, let's take a look at some of our later Enlightenment thinkers then here. Later Enlightenment thinkers then, we're going to again shift a bit more towards other things, but we're going to have here Adam Smith, for example. The Wealth of Nations in 1776, hugely important book. We'll go into a lot more detail about it, but he opposes that idea of mercantilism. He wants free trade, no more monopolies, no more any of that kind of stuff. This is the idea from the French of laissez-faire, which is that the government should be hands-off. Government should reduce their influence on economic decisions. Now, Smith still thinks the government has a role. He thinks that the government should be there to do things like enforce worker rights or to help poor people or people who are unable to work. They still have a reason to be there, but by and large, they shouldn't have the choice. So under mercantilism, remember, the government of England can give somebody a monopoly if they want to and say, you're the only people who get to trade with the East Indies or whatever. He would say, no, we should be able to let anybody do that. If 4 companies go to do that and they compete against each other, that's good, because that means they will all try to undercut each other. They'll try to make, more money off of that. And then eventually, if some of those companies are bad companies or just not competitive, they'll fade away and we'll end up with the best of them. It's the foundation of modern capitalism in so many ways. So hugely important and influential. Next up, we got Thomas Paine, T-Pain, as we always like to call him. He's going to write a book called The Age of Reason in 1794. He is a nonconformist religious figure, a religious person. He is not big on sort of traditional religion. He gets in a lot of trouble for it during his day. But one of the big ones for him here is that he is laying out the concept of deism. Now, he is not the first guy to come up with this, really. He's just the one who's really putting it out there, what is already sort of out there already. So the idea here is that this is a very different perspective on God from what we might have today, especially. If you know people who are evangelical, or perhaps you're evangelical yourself, you believe that in the day-to-day life that we live, God has a lot of influence. So we pray before football games. We say our prayers at night. We bless our food, all that kind of stuff, because we feel that God is involved in our lives. Evangelicals feel they're involved in our lives, and they have these kind of aspects to them. Paine would argue that that's not the case. That God is not involved in the day-to-day of our lives. So whether or not our favorite football team wins or not is not something that God particularly cares about. What happens is that God essentially set the world in motion, right? And we need to figure it out. So God is a watchmaker. He makes this very intricate system of our world and our people and all that. And then he sets it, I guess kind of winds it up, to continue the metaphor, winds it up and then lets it go. Okay? And then doesn't really deal with a lot of it. He's not answering prayers and stuff. So the idea then for these folks, which also very much applies to scientific revolution folks, they like this idea too, is the idea that the world is in motion and we can figure it out, that the world runs by these laws that God has set up. And if we're able to figure those laws out, we can figure out sort of how to make this world even better in the eyes of God. This idea was very popular with founders. So, for example, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Paine himself was a founder. A lot of them were really big believers in this. So you'll sometimes hear people talk about how America was founded as a Christian nation. It's not untrue, but it's a little more complicated, right? The people who founded it were Christians. They would consider themselves Christians. They write lots of religious language into some of the founding documents. But at the same time, it's historically it's different what they consider religion versus today. They would probably not be 100% down with sort of some of the modern versions of Christianity that we have. Not that they would oppose it, but it would just be that wouldn't be their thing really, right? Whereas we would probably say, well, you don't ever go to church or whatever, which is something that, we tend to do a lot of today. All right, lastly, I want to make sure to include this lady, Mary Wollstonecraft. So one thing about the Enlightenment is that it does include a lot of women. However, while it includes a lot of women, they again are not they are not as educated. Like women in general were not educated or sent to school. So most of the women who are involved in this are going to be sort of upper class women or women who are able to afford these kind of things. So there are obviously less women involved here, but they do a number of very, very important things out there. So, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft, looking at all these Enlightenment ideals about government and about God and all these things, she says, well, what about us? Like, you say that every man has these freedoms, but what about women? Should women be included as well? So she writes a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. It is a very early feminist document that advocates for equal rights for men and women. Now, she is still very much a part of this kind of like concept of women in the home, men, working outside. But it's one of our first documents in the West that really like talks about these equal rights being an important thing to do. Also, fun fact, Mary Wollstonecraft, her daughter was very famous. Her name was Mary Shelley, and she wrote Frankenstein. All right? I mean, right? Kind of a little weird. Anyway, little fun fact for you there. Next up, let's talk about a couple of other Enlightenment-influenced ideas. Sorry that the text over there is so super tiny. But a couple of other Enlightenment-influenced ideas. These are ones that basically kind of stem out of these. Maybe they don't have a specific founder or like a person or whatever, but they're kind of things that come up around this time. One thing we're going to see then is conservatism versus classical liberalism. Now, this is very different than our conservatives and liberals today. So don't twist this up about like politics and stuff. What this is basically is conservatism in this time period advocates things like monarchies and like powerful monarchies and conservative traditional ways. Classical liberalism, on the other hand, then would be to move away from those things. So conservatism in this period was a belief in traditional ideas, including monarchy and no new ideological theories, whereas classical liberalism would advocate for natural rights, constitutional government, laissez-faire economics. Excuse me, parched. Britain was controlled by classical liberals in this period and saw good parliamentary government and expansion of voting. So pretty much like almost all American modern political parties and those of Europe are also going to come from this concept, right? Like however you feel about modern day politics, like generally speaking, both parties in America and others as well would advocate for a lot of the things of classical liberalism, right? Constitutional government, laissez-faire economics, these kind of things are not controversial. Like one group may advocate for a little more government control or one may advocate for something else, but nobody really advocates monarchy anymore, at least I hope not, as an example of that. One example of expansion of voting here in Britain, right above me here, you'll see a picture. That picture is the parliamentary, is about the Chartist movement, okay? So what this is that in Britain they had a lot of they had a lot of people who couldn't vote. It was mostly like wealthier people and upper class people. And so a lot of them, with the increase in education and working class and all this, they started to advocate for this. So there are a couple of different charters that are written to expand the voting franchise from just the kind of landed to more people instead. So that's kind of that expansion of voting. There's a couple different charters. There's like one in like 1842, I think, and a couple other ones. But you can see the image up there as a kind of editorial cartoon. You got Parliament there, and they are all aghast as the commoners push the charter into Parliament to try to get some sort of access. We also, of course, will have the beginnings of socialism. This is not communism yet. Communism comes a bit later. But utopian socialism in particular believe that the means of production should be owned by the workers. So the factories that are going to come about as a result of the Industrial Revolution should, instead of being owned by capitalists, by people who are putting money in, they should be owned by the workers themselves. A lot of people found it very popular as a solution to the ills of the Industrial Revolution. We will talk about those ills later, but they're pretty bad. Like people working all day in factories and dying of horrible diseases and stuff. So this was considered to be a way potentially to help stop some of those problems. Two examples, these folks at the time, Charles Fourier and Robert Owen, are going to be examples. They were believers in what they called Fabian socialism, which was the idea that it needed to be sort of like gently introduced through government. Like you didn't want to like just overthrow everything, but instead you should try to like vote it in instead. So we can see that influence in places like, well, Britain, as well as lots of Europe, where a number of countries over there have brought up new laws for like things like welfare programs and government-sponsored healthcare and things like that. All right. Our last one here, a couple of other abolition influenced, Enlightenment influenced ideals. Let's talk about abolitionism and also then Zionism. So abolitionism is the slave trade was banned in the early 1800s, as we mentioned in the last unit, but slavery was still legal for a very long period of time, especially in parts of Europe and the Americas. Largely, I think we mentioned this before, you're going to see the decline of the slave trade based around kind of how much people needed it. So like Brazil is one of the last people to abolish it because they needed it, right? Whereas in Britain, they really don't have a lot of slaves because they don't do a lot of plantation agriculture. So there it's like, they're just like, yeah, let's go ahead and ban it. And then the people who were slaves are now free and they can just work for us. Like we'll just pay them something instead. So that is a part of it. But to get to that point, though, there's a bunch of what are called abolition movements. So abolitionist movements are huge. They are big all the way around the world, in European areas at least. So in America, of course, the abolitionist movement gets real big in like the 1820s, 1830s. It is some of their advocacy that will push the South to be incredibly upset and try to push themselves out of the United States. And so these abolition movements are based upon the ideas that all human beings are equal, that they have equal rights and should be benefiting from that. Serfdom was also abolished in this period as well. So most of it's pretty early, like Britain in 1574. France is 1789, which is like the revolution, but it's like there weren't really a lot of serfs in France at that point. But like, most of them had already been freed. So still, that's the formal end of it. Russia, then, of course, as we mentioned before, is real laid back about getting rid of serfdom. So Catherine the Great, of course, famously after the Pugachev Rebellion, just kind of like reinforces it a lot. But finally, in 1861, Russia's like, yeah, maybe we don't need this medieval stuff here with the serfs that we have. So they ban it in that time period. All right, lastly, let's go ahead and get some flame wars started. Let's talk about Zionism. Let's talk about the Middle East for a second. We're going to do this as best we can to kind of keep it in the middle. We definitely have a lot of people who have different perspectives on different things, but let's talk about it in a historical sense. So Zionism is the term historically to refer to the desire of Jewish people to establish an independent homeland. Now, this is in the Middle East. Actually, very early on, that wasn't necessarily what was going to happen. Like a lot of early Zionists believed that they could maybe establish one somewhere else, like they could do it in maybe a part of Africa or something, which has its own problems, but they can maybe put it someplace else instead. Eventually, though, the Zionist movement does come back around to this idea of ancient Israel, that the area where Jewish people were traditionally lived. So the idea then is that more and more Jewish people will move to this region, and we see throughout sort of the late 19th, early 20th century, and maybe even a little bit before then, we're going to start to see more and more Jewish immigration to the area that is known to the British as Palestine. So what will happen here is eventually this area is under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, the British will take control of it and will occupy that little space that we see up there. And then we will see this partition plan that will happen in 1947, basically. But before we get to all that, and that'll be an after World War II thing, the reason that Zionism really gains a lot of influence from amongst the Jewish people is that there's a lot of years of anti-Semitism. So one of the leaders of Zionism is a guy named Theodor Herzl. He and others are like, look, people hate us, like in Europe. People are treating us really poorly. No matter how many times we go through this and things get better, it just continually has this problem. So we need this homeland. And he's right. Like, this was a problem. Like, they kept having pogroms and stuff. Like, we saw this in the last unit. I had the little video, or the little slide on the slides that showed how often, like, Jewish people were kicked out of regions of Europe and how terrible that was. One of the big things that will push this even farther is that in the late 19th century, we have this thing called the Dreyfus Affair. Now, if you want to know the details of the Dreyfus Affair, you're welcome to look them up. You don't need to know the specific details. Essentially, a French army officer who was Jewish is accused of like spying or something, basically. And so the reason that he was accused is because he was Jewish. Like, they just didn't trust him. They were like, well, he's not really French, even though he and his family had lived in France for like hundreds and hundreds of years and he had been born there. They still kind of accused him of being sort of an outsider in a sense. So when this whole Dreyfus Affair takes place, then it will push this idea of Zionism even further to the surface and have even more Jewish people moving to this region. Now, just to give you a preface, of course, in the long run, after World War I, the Ottomans collapse. This area becomes a British mandate. They have something called the Balfour Declaration, which is that they support the idea of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And so in 1947, after World War II and all the horrors of the Holocaust, the terrors and things of the Holocaust, they decide the UN decides that they will try to create a new country there. So you can see here that the sort of dark colors here, well, I can't get my, but if you see here on the kind of thing here, the kind of darkish, I guess that's green or something, are places that were predominantly Arabic, and the lighter green were places where Jewish people lived. So the idea was that they were essentially going to create two different countries maybe here, but you can already see the problem with this map. It's all broken up. It's wild. Like Jerusalem was going to be an independent area that was not controlled by either group. So it becomes problematic, and we will talk in more detail about that after when we talk about World War II. But essentially, as you probably know, if you read the headlines, it doesn't work out very well, and there's been conflict and chaos throughout the Middle East ever since then. And we'll talk more about that in the future when we get around to it. All right, that is just about at 30 minutes. Look at me. That was my goal. Good job, Osborne. I hope y'all are doing well. Obviously, if you ever have any questions about any of this stuff, please shoot me an email or ask me or talk to me anytime. Thanks so much for paying attention, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye, guys.